Family Shepherds by Voddie Baucham. To put this review in context, I really need to begin by saying I had very high hopes for this book. I'm a big fan of Voddie's work on opposing cultural Marxism and wokeness. He's a homeschool dad. I'm a homeschool dad. We have very similar views on the importance of discipline, also keeping the family together as a family unit. And as I started this book, I thought, Voddie, with this book, you are going to be preaching to the choir, and I'm the choir. So bring it, brother. I really want to see what you have to say in this book. Well, it turns out I don't think I would be welcomed in Voddie Baucham's choir. Let's hit on the good, though, first. I loved Voddie's emphasis on the centrality of the family, and I am 100% in agreement that our society and even our churches are doing too much to split up the family. When kids are always at kids' church or kids' Sunday school or youth group, it may be a nice break from their parents to not have to be with the kids all the time, but it also robs parents, and especially fathers, of the important role they should have in shepherding their kids into the faith of Jesus Christ. We need more of a focus in our churches of ministries and worship and service and discipleship opportunities that include the entire family unit together. And I think Voddie Baucham is right on point in his emphasis on this in the opening chapters of this book. His writings on how your family, and especially your marriage, is more important than your career is something every man should take to heart. And I love the simple line he had to illustrate this reality. A man can have many careers, but only one wife. Don't ruin your marriage for a career that is easily replaceable by another. This followed with good teachings on how our relationship with our spouse is more important than our relationship with our kids. In fact, if you want to have a godly relationship with your kids, it must start with the strong foundation of the relationship between father and mother. Men, your wives must come first before your daughters and your sons. His teaching on how the gospel is good news and not good law was also welcomed and important, because the gospel is news. The gospel is recorded fact. The gospel is what Jesus did and what Jesus promises in light of what he did. The gospel is not commands that are given for us to live by in order to please Jesus. The works we do as it relates to the gospel are not part of the gospel, but they should be seen as distinct, as the fruits of the gospel. You see, godly living can only really come following faith in the person of Jesus Christ and trusting in him and his completed work. So there was a lot of good in this book that I really loved. His teaching on corporal punishment was also brilliant and well received by this reviewer, and I would recommend that specific instruction on discipline and punishment for all parents, especially those who are following in the spirit of this age and removing corporal punishment from their home. But there was also some bad in this book. And man, did he just ruin it for me at points. Voddie would make these pointed jabs and drive-by attacks against people who could and maybe should be his allies. And from my viewpoint, was needlessly throwing people under the bus in a way that just seemed arrogant and harsh. He spoke on dispensationalists who couldn't teach parenting properly because dispensationalists don't use the Old Testament in their teaching on families. I grew up in dispensational churches. I pastor one now, and I have heard multiple teachings based upon Deuteronomy 6 and the family, which is something that Voddie claims I wouldn't be hearing if I was a lifelong dispensationalist. He also attacked other discipleship books as not being based upon the Bible. Now, I've read a lot of books on discipleship, and I can't think of a single one of them that was not founded upon the scripture. Now, I may not have agreed with their methods or their interpretations, but to say that other discipleship books aren't based on the Bible is just a ridiculous attack that leaves me thinking, Voddie, why would you even say that? I also disagreed with his emphasis on catechisms for the smallest of children. I do not want my 2-year-old or my 5-year-old learning systematic theology through catechisms. I just don't. At that age, I want them learning the narrative of the Bible, the full story from beginning to end, and then to develop systematic theology from the scriptures as it is appropriate. I think the only thing you really teach a child at that age through the use of catechisms is to develop biblical understandings from outside of the Bible itself, and then to become dependent upon theologians and creeds for biblical truth and not the scriptures themselves, which is not a wise practice. The Westminster Confession is flawed. The London Baptist Confession is flawed. And I don't want my kids to be pre-hardwired into thinking that they need to follow those confessional statements. I want them to begin with the Bible. And I want the scriptures and the stories of the Bible to be their primary source for truth for the early years of their development, and then they can supplement it with sources outside of the scripture. The other thing that drove me crazy was his theological determinism, which came across at many points throughout the book, which is more properly known as Reformed theology or Calvinism. Take, for example, the times that he spent attacking Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism. That's just dumb. No one who is reading his book is also out there reading Pelagian. No one is following him, and to use him as the label for your opponents is really to use a boogeyman in order to manipulate naive Christians into becoming fatalistic Calvinists, because you don't want to be labeled with those Pelagius, so you want to run as far away from them as possible. I want Calvinists like Voddie to argue for their view, campaign for it, without resorting to the tactic of comparing Christians today with a guy whose writings no one is reading and no one is following today. But Voddie's determinism was seen in how he made the assumption in his book that a saved family shepherd will evangelize and disciple his kids. Not should, but he will. A sign of conversion is the perseverance of a father to guide his kids to the truth of the gospel and then discipline them into Christ-likeness. And to that I say, no! We cannot assume that those who are converted, that those who believe in the gospel will disciple their families and lead them to Christ. We can't assume that that's going to happen. I think this book was written because we should not make that assumption that Christian men will be godly family shepherds. Saved, believing fathers can make a shipwreck of their family and raise children who will reject Jesus Christ because fathers are inactive in the process of raising their children. Voddie even provided a great example of this through his use of the writings of George Whitefield as the outline of one entire chapter in this book. Whitefield was a great evangelist, but by all accounts, he was a pretty awful husband. Most of the time, he tried to keep himself separated from his wife by the entire Atlantic Ocean. Whitefield only had one child who died in childbirth, in large part because Whitefield was an absentee husband. But Whitefield also had wonderful teachings on how to lead a household. So Whitefield believed in being a godly family shepherd, but he sure didn't live it. Therefore, we need to tell our fathers in the church that it is not a natural result of faith in the gospel that you will then become a good father. If we want Christian men to be godly shepherds, they need to be intentional in pointing their families toward faith in Jesus Christ. And I think this book would have been a lot more effective if Voddie would have dropped the determinism that was sprinkled throughout the book. So this book for me was a mixed bag. There was some really good stuff. The exact places that I was hoping for good stuff, I did find some wonderful teachings in here. But it was kind of ruined for me in places by those needless attacks at the people that Voddie Baucham disagrees with, for those people who are not Reformed or who have the audacity of putting their kids in Sunday school classes. And I gotta say, if you're watching this review and you come from a Reformed or a Calvinistic background, you're probably gonna love every single thing Voddie puts in this book. And I really want to recommend it because there is some quality teaching to fathers here. But in the end, I don't think this is going to be a high recommendation for me. Maybe a small one, because you can get some good pieces of information out here. I think I would rather, though, recommend Tony Evans's book on being a kingdom man for how to lead your household into the grace of Jesus Christ. And if you enjoyed this review and you want to stay engaged in the moving and challenging world of Christian literature, I encourage you to subscribe to the Rev Reads YouTube channel.